Reich has one other tape loop piece with spoken word, similar techniques.
I had to open the bruise up and let some of the bruise blood come out to show them, 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 come.
And then he takes it back to more, shall we say, a musical realm with a piece called Melodica, which is a small musical fragment performed on the reed keyboard that Jean-Baptiste uses on Stephen Colbert. And then ask himself, can this sort of technique be done live with players? And the answer is yes, if the players are good enough. Steve has a percussion background, drummer background, so he takes what arguably on the piano are two drumming licks. And you know, the two high C's on the piano in C, they're often played by a percussionist anyway. Steve was the original, I think, Pulse. Don't quote me on that. So in this case, it's a little fragment of E minor 7, no third, with F sharp power chord above, just oscillating the two notes. Put them together in Hocket, and you get like this. Megan Cullen and I did this in an Opus project. One piano player starts, the other comes in, they're in rhythmic unison, and then one of the pianists gradually increases tempo until the point where the one is a 16th beat ahead of the other. And in between you get kind of this spangly thing going. And since there are actually 12 little 16th note pulses there are 12 permutations that can go around. Steve at one point has an idea which he calls music as a gradual process, and indeed these things unfold. They require a certain amount of patience, and yet once again, like the Terry Riley Poppy No Good's All Night Flight, one can just kind of take in this texture as it goes. There's a lot of post-apocalyptic aspects of Steve's music, and I think that's also true of clapping music. Once again, it's in 6, and you could think of it as drumming motifs again. We can all go along with it. Say after me, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. Heard this done live in southeastern Pennsylvania. One of the performers was Steve Reich, and the other was Glenn Velez, one of the Steve Reich musician people. He's also done some very interesting solo work. They're right up to the microphone and boom, 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 etc. The key is, instead of phasing, jumping from one eighth note to the next. Here's a nice scrolling score, or spastic score. from clapping music, music for pieces of wood, that would be 5 clave players, and then music for mallet instruments, voices, and percussion, so he's building up again. And then the largest yet, which in some ways is really quite a masterpiece, although drumming is too. And by the time he does music for 18 musicians, which is about as large as Steve Reich and musicians becomes, he has studied Balinese gamelan. And he notices that in the signaling, Balinese gamelan is done by drummers or telephone players, and so he does something similar in this piece. Also, the harmony in this piece. I asked Steve once about, well, we were talking about rhythm, and I said, Steve, your rhythm's been extensively analyzed by you and also by critics, but what about your harmony? And he said, that's a good question, Mark. Good question, Mark. Get it? No one's really talked about that very much. He said to me it's rather intuitive, comes out of his jazz, and maybe his contemporary classical modal experience. So in Music for 18 Musicians, he said that there are more chord changes in the first couple of minutes than in entire pieces before that. And I think that's really true. How do the chords change? By the breath of a bass clarinetist. When the performer runs out of breath, time to change chords. And also then later, the mallet percussion signals with little kind of characteristic figures when it's time to change from one area to another. And the singers, again, above, sort of in the spirit of drumming, seem to do something semi-improvisational, hearing what's happening in the overall contrapuntal textures of the piece, and then emphasizing certain heard motifs, sometimes that actually don't exist, discreetly. That tradition that goes back to Alleluia and Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony. By this point, he's studied African drumming and Balinese gamelan, and he starts to say, well, what about my own tradition? And indeed, here's some nice quotes, if I can keep the book open. And he said, I'm not African, I'm not Balinese, though I respect those traditions. I began to ask myself, do I have anything like that? My experiences with African and Balinese music made me curious about my own Hebraic background. And in pursuing that, I began to find out things did flow together. I got a book and a teacher as usual. The book was Jewish Music by Abraham Edelson, a contemporary of Bartok, and similar as a musicologist. So after a 1977 tour for music of 18 musicians, this is about when he's writing music for a large ensemble, which is an orchestra. He's finally going back to that tradition, or first going to this tradition. So after a 1977 tour of music for 18 musicians, my wife Beryl and I flew to Israel from London, nice work if you can get it, and spent 2 weeks working with a man from the National Archive of Recorded Sound in Jerusalem. What's happening technically in cantillation is that a different group of motifs, about 22, are permuted, not according to some mathematical scheme, but to make sense of the sacred text in musical terms, and it exists in Arabic music too, and this is maybe a later key. I am just beginning to understand motivic permutation, and this beginning to surface in music for a large ensemble. You can write a longer line and still get them out of pre-existent material, but the effect is of a long melodic line, and you will hear this also in octet, now renamed 8 lines. And the reason it's been renamed is because the original performers were multi-instrumentalists, jazz players, and Broadway musical players often double. You might play flute, oboe, clarinet, saxophone, bassoon, but classically trained people, sometimes they just specialize in one, and I have to say for myself, I can play all of the aforementioned except the top one, the flute, not too good, something with the embouchure. So in 8 lines, there are always 8 lines of music, but you can have a different flute player when the flute line comes and the clarinet line disappears. And similarly, the double and triple stops were pretty tricky on the strings, so allowing for more string instruments. This does have, you'll hear as it evolves, sort of a jazz Hebrew cantillation line, a very long melody. First we've really heard from Reich in the flute, and it starts out at his motive, a do-so, C-sharp Dorian. There's the la-ti-do, and starts with open fifth. Then it's kind of a ninth, no third, no seventh. So chord. Fantastic.